In September of 1620, 35 saints and 67 strangers set sail from the port of Plymouth on the coast of England. Their goal? To establish a second permanent English colony in North America.
These were people primarily defined by their religious identity. They were Puritans, which was a term that meant that they were trying to purify the Protestant religion in England. They felt that it had not sufficiently broken with Catholic precedent, that there were too many ceremonies and too much of the church hierarchy that had been carried over from Catholicism. They were increasingly in conflict with the king and with the upper hierarchy of the church, the bishops and the archbishops, who didn't think that the church should make any more changes, that it had reached just the right level of reformation. And they then proceeded to try to purge the church of these Puritan elements.
The group had been granted permission to settle in Northern Virginia, but when they arrive at Cape Cod instead, outside London Company territory, they draw up a document to legitimize their position before they leave the ship.
We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James, do by these presents, solemnly and mutually, in ye presence of God and one of another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic, and by virtue hereof to enact laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time, as shall be thought most meet and convenient for ye general good of ye colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience.
It isn't long before other Puritans decide to risk the voyage.
Especially after the mid-1620s, when there was a new king, King Charles I, and some new archbishops who were hardliners about trying to suppress Puritanism. Many Puritans in England thought that they needed to get out.
The people who embark on these journeys are quite different from those who signed on for passage to the Chesapeake.
People have, in fact, analyzed the ship lists, and we know a lot about the early settlement patterns, what towns they went to, what little patch of land they lived on, and so on, and who they brought with them. Because New Englanders, the colonial New Englanders, were nothing if not committed to keeping lots and lots of records. The dominant group in the migration would have been families with parents in their late 20s, 30s, even early 40s. That is to say, people of some substance and maturity.
They were people who owned some property, who owned their own farm or their own shop back in England. And so we have much more of an age spectrum, from children to young adults to even old people who are going together as intact family groups. They're going with some property of their own. They're paying their own way.
Some people crossed because they were drawn by the prospect of cheap or free land. Some people were drawn by a spirit of adventure. Some people were disappointed and went back. But the majority of New Englanders were sort of self-selecting Puritans who wanted to establish a godly community in the New World, the kind of community that they had tried and failed to establish in the Old World. People often say that the Puritans came to New England because they were being persecuted in Old England. There's an element of truth to that, but many people in England might have said that the Puritans left because they had tried and failed to persecute everybody else in England, and that they now wanted to persecute others in North America.
If you looked at that, you would find large numbers of people who came with a congregation, maybe not everybody in the congregation, but a big subset of a church in England would come, would travel together, and would settle together. And that's one reason all you have to do is look at the place names of New England and compare them to Old England to see a lot of that kind of continuity. And then, of course, there's the word of mouth. People writing back, the people who are, in effect, the kind of advanced scouts. We're here, it looks good, you should come over. There are people who write and say, I have never been so miserable in my whole life, and I wish I could come home.
As an Englishman studying early American history, I think it's very important to recognize that when people crossed the Atlantic, they didn't sort of dump all their cultural baggage overboard. They were very much Englishmen and Englishwomen living in a new world, and that new world transformed their lives in many respects, but they still, in many other respects, remained a product of the culture they had come from. So it's important for us to understand the culture they came from and the way in which the various attitudes and structures that they brought with them gradually, but only gradually, transformed and adapted in these very different circumstances. But rather than thinking of the colonists as Americans, it's in some ways more helpful and perhaps more revealing to think about the interaction between their identity as English men and women and their experiences in this very different environment, which then reconstituted their Englishness, their Europeanness, in very fascinating ways.
That is, of course, a matter of some ongoing discussion and debate. People have generally talked about it in regional terms because the groups that come are very much differentiated by the region in England from which they come, the region in the American colonies to which they come, and the motives that animated them, as well as the social profile of the group, does vary significantly.
For example, the fact that some of the colonists had encountered Irish resistance to colonization during the latter half of the 16th century influences their attitude toward Native Americans.
They saw the Irish as a very barbaric people who needed to be settled and civilized, and they were disconcerted by the unwillingness of many of the Irish to go along with this. And they certainly came to North America with a very lively sense of the dangers, the challenges of settling a land in which there was already a group of people living who were allegedly savage and certainly culturally very, very different and disconcertingly uncooperative at times. The initial experiences of explorers in North America resulted in two very different sets of expectations. On the one hand, Native Americans seemed to be very friendly and cooperative and generous-spirited. On the other hand, they seemed to be, from a European perspective, horrifyingly different, which for them meant inferior and savage. And there was a tremendous ambivalence on the part of the early colonists whether to perceive the Native Americans in positive, constructive terms or as a threatening, dangerous obstacle. The fact that the colonists are first very weak and need Native American cooperation, of course, encourages them to interact with them somewhat constructively.
In the midst of the political and social turmoil that characterizes the reign of Charles I, Puritan merchants obtain a grant of land and a charter from the king to create the Massachusetts Bay Company.
They discover that unlike other corporate charters, there is no residency clause in the Massachusetts Bay Company. It doesn't say the Massachusetts Bay Company of London. The Virginia Company was the Virginia Company of London. It doesn't say anything like that. And so what they do is take the charter along to America with them, and over the course of a little more than 10 years, they convert it into a functioning constitution for the colony itself. So it's really not a money-making operation in itself, the way the Virginia Company was supposed to be. It really is a structure for a colony.
Massachusetts Bay was economically the most successful, geographically the most expansionist of the New England colonies, was an irritant to the crown. From the very beginning, Massachusetts Bay, and to some extent New England more broadly, had a high sense that local prerogatives, local authority, local privileges were important. So that in New England, they saw themselves as recapturing the authority that had been under assault by Charles I.
And so they established the town meeting, what is to become the cornerstone of community life, of local control.
The town meeting was absolutely central to the functioning of a community in early New England, and in some ways still is today. It was attended by all of the adult free males. It was in some ways a remarkably democratic institution for its time, though the opinion of a principal householder would have carried probably much more weight than the opinion of a young male who was only just starting out on adult life. So most of the decisions taken in a town were taken at the meeting, not in private by various officials.
There was a dispute over exactly how much authority local magistrates were supposed to have. And on one side, not surprisingly the side held by the magistrates, John Winthrop, for instance, that their view was all government comes from the consent of the people. But once that consent has been given, the people choose leaders who know what they're doing. And they defer or delegate authority to them. And once they've done that, they should kind of shut up and take their medicine, you know, they should do what they're told. But there were other people who said, no, this is a continuing process of oversight and consent.
The church itself is also a governing influence in the life of the community.
Whereas in England, everybody within a local community was assumed to belong to the local church, in New England, the church consisted of people who actually made the choice to come together and sign a covenant and thus constitute themselves as a covenanted congregational community. And whereas in England power came from the top down, in New England power rested with the congregation itself. The congregation voted as to whether to admit new members. It voted to hire and fire ministers. In some churches, women were allowed to vote. Becoming a church member was one of the few public distinctions that women could achieve autonomously on their own.
While there is a formal separation between church and state in places like Massachusetts Bay, for example, clergymen hold no civil office in Massachusetts. There are other features of this political polity that we would think of as being very intrusive in terms of the demands that religion is able to make on government. For example, it's part of the legal code in Massachusetts that everyone, irrespective of their faith, what church they belong to, for most of the 17th century, everybody is bound by law to pay taxes to support the Puritan clergy.
The communities created in New England are more tightly clustered than the English villages they'd left.
In many cases, the townsfolk would be given two plots of land, one in the center, a small plot for the house itself, and then a larger plot outside the town center for farming on. So instead of living in the middle of your farming plot, you'd be more likely to live in this tightly clustered little community in which everybody could keep watch.
The church charters of New England had a wonderful phrase. Each member of the church was enjoined to keep a holy watchfulness over others. And that can lead to a multitude of sins. That's mostly, I mean, what they meant, of course, was that you would watch for the spiritual welfare of members of your household, but also everyone around you. In practice, this can turn into sheer nosiness for the sake of it, and it can also turn into a kind of presumption that you have an obligation and a right to give people advice, lots of advice.
Many very respectable, godly couples were hauled into court or before their local church congregations because they'd engaged in premarital sex, not because these young people rejected conventional morality, but because on both sides of the Atlantic, many ordinary people believed that the boundary between licit and illicit sex was not public marriage, but betrothal. And the Puritan authorities found it very difficult to get all of their church members to accept one version of moral respectability.
At the very heart of Puritanism is an extraordinary level of subversiveness. Puritanism is a belief that puts tremendous emphasis on the individual's relationship to God, unmediated by a church, by sacraments, by a minister. Nobody is supposed to tell you what to believe. You read the Bible, and you have a relationship with God. This is a tremendously individualistic and empowering and dangerous belief in a lot of ways. And it's a belief that some people took more seriously than the Puritans wanted them to do. Anne Hutchinson took it more seriously.
Mistress Hutchinson, you are called here as one of those that have troubled the peace of the Commonwealth and the churches here. You are known to be a woman that hath had a great share in the promoting and divulging of those opinions that are the cause of this trouble. And you have maintained a meeting and an assembly in your house that hath been condemned by the General Assembly as a thing not tolerable, nor comely in the sight of God, nor fitting for your sex. Therefore we have thought good to send for you, to understand how things are, that if you be in an erroneous way, we may reduce you, that so you may become a profitable member here among us.
I am called here to answer before you, but I can hear no things laid to my charge.
I have told you some already, and more I can tell you.
Name one, sir.
Why do you keep such a meeting at your house, as you do every week upon a set day?
I conceive there lies a clear rule in Titus, that the elder women should instruct the younger, and then I must find a time wherein I must do it. If you convince me there is no rule, then I shall yield.
This rule crosses that in the Corinthians, but you must take it in this sense, that elder women must instruct the younger about their business, and to love their husbands and not to make them clash. I am persuaded that the revelation she brings forth is delusion. Therefore, if it be the mind of the court that Mistress Hutchinson, for the things that appear before us, is unfit for our society, let them hold up their hand. Mistress Hutchinson, the sentence of the court you hear is that you are banished from out of our jurisdiction as being a woman not fit for our society, and are to be imprisoned until the court shall send you away.
I desire to know wherefore I am banished.
Say no more. The court knows wherefore, and is satisfied.
Come away with you.
Some of the most vociferous and dangerous challenges to Puritanism came not from people who said, we don't believe a word of this. It came precisely from people who said, we believe every word of this, and we take it more seriously than you, the ministers, do. We are relying on our reading of the Bible, and you can't tell us otherwise, because if you do, you're the one who's backsliding. You're the one who's distorting the doctrine. So that's clearly an unintended consequence, and that too opens up challenges to authority that are destabilizing and disconcerting to the people in charge. So part of what the Puritans discovered was that the Catholic Church knew something about keeping people in order.
Just how successful are the Puritans in establishing the godly community they'd envisioned?
That was never really possible to the degree that they would have liked, and there were many reasons for that. One was that in order to have a viable colony, they had to admit craftsmen and artisans who weren't necessarily very godly but had the skills they needed. And many of these people proved to be a thorn in the sides of Puritan magistrates and church officials. Also, many church folk were less exclusive in their adherence to orthodoxy than Puritan leaders would have liked.
Many people would argue that a lot of the traditional constraints and supports of traditional society and community life were eroded in America because of the opportunities for mobility and the challenges of that mobility and broader land ownership presented. People who had easier access to land need not feel dependent on their father to inherit land. They need not feel dependent on the local landowner that kept them in a state of tenancy, and that meant that they could speak their mind in town meetings. They didn't have to vote the way their father or their landowner wanted. They didn't have to marry who their father wanted them to marry. So from one fact, easier availability of land, flows political consequences, personal consequences.
The New England colonists, in contrast to those who settled in areas of the Chesapeake, are more interested in staying put than spreading out. But as rapid population growth begins to overtake them, people inevitably begin to move beyond town boundaries.
The movement to form new towns, which were kind of budded off, older towns, they referred to them as hivings off, and they lamented that. It seemed in some ways to weaken the strength and the core of the original communitarian impulse. When they opened a town, when they chartered a town, or were given a charter for a town, each family would be given a plot of land. And in the early going, each family would then with the next generation, in effect subdivide the land. Now, obviously that could only go on for so long, but it could go on for a couple of generations. So there was less need. So in general, so there is a period in which the New Englanders do not need to expand, and in some ways don't want to expand, and that helps, or it avoids some of the worst confrontations with Indians.
This kind of family-centered colonization promoted by John Smith proves to be a breakthrough for the English.
But I think it also is important to say that that was a tragedy for the Indians, because it ultimately made their use of the land impossible. And I think this is something that people only very dimly understood at the beginning, because the Indians had an extensive land use system, so that while they may have cultivated intensively a small acreage, they, in fact, in hunting and in their various kinds of gathering, which was an integral part of their life, used lands extensively.
It's fairly clear that Native Americans did not realize at first, I think, just how much of a danger the New Englanders were going to pose to Native Americans as they became more confident, more established, and began to move further and further inland onto Native American land.
And as the Europeans began to come in and build settlements, build farms, claim land, say this land is mine and my children's and my grandchildren's forever, it very quickly, I think, before people fully understood, made the Indian land use impossible. Ironically, I think, it is the peaceful farmer, not the soldiers, who really made this kind of clash between the native way of life and the imported European way of life almost inevitable, or virtually inevitable.
Puritan relations with Indians did sour quite quickly. So you get the Pequot War, 1637, 7 years after Winthrop leads his Puritan friends ashore. And that's a nasty war. So nasty that the Puritans were bent upon wiping the Pequot from the face of the earth. And at the root of it was land. Most of those they didn't kill, they sent to the Caribbean islands to be traded for African slaves, and that's how slavery came to New England. A prisoner exchange, in effect.
When the Puritans first came, they told themselves, and they told fellow Puritans in England, that one of their prime purposes was to convert the Indians. And they became the subject of a lot of criticism from the English Puritans. So in response to that criticism, during the 1640s and 1650s, the Puritans did start to establish missions among the Indians, missions that they call praying towns, in which they would put pressure on the Indians to move into these communities that would be almost exclusively Indian, but in which they would have to adopt the clothing, the housing, all of the customs, and especially the religious beliefs of the Puritans. And not all the Indians could bring themselves to even try.
To some historians, these praying towns are forerunners of the reservation system that will later be enacted.
The Puritans, very early reservation system to isolate as many Indians as possible onto small land areas, and then to exploit Indian land and resources, run by magistrates, agents, who laid down certain laws, including no alcohol, no firearms, no visiting by foreign Indians to come in and speak with them. They wanted to keep them isolated. King Philip decided that he was not going to allow this, and so he rose up against the Puritans in the Second Major War.
I think most people would say that King Philip's War in 1675-76 was very devastating, very high rates of mortality on both sides, very destructive in terms of property, and very embittering in its consequences. A very, the kind of conflict that left both sides with a permanent hatred of the other, the kind that's just embedded and difficult to unpack in any way. That was such a decisive defeat for the Indians that there then ensued relative peace because the Indians had been dispatched. The frontier, though, and the frontiers of all the colonies, are often given over to sometimes skirmishes and sometimes more sustained often very fierce, very brutal attacks on both sides, by both sides, on both sides.
Half a century after the Puritans' arrival in New England, the story enters yet another phase, as new groups enter the scene and the Old World challenges the colony's self-proclaimed independence. The Unfinished Nation is a 52-part American history series. For more information about this program and accompanying materials, call 1-800-576-2988 or visit us online at www.intelecom.org.